you have had some sensational experiences. You're quite the endurance athlete. Can you give us some tips? Like what do you think has led to you being able to do these extraordinary feats?
Well, I think in my case, it's incorrigible curiosity. I mean, I didn't really set out to be an endurance athlete as much as I set out to explore interesting parts of the world. But in the early days, I had to set world records to get my crazy trips paid for. So the endurance was kind of a byproduct of curiosity. I'm actually not a huge fan of ultra endurance exercise. I think it's a bad strategy for the long run. You can get away with it in your 20s and 30s, but a much better strategy for the long run is walking. Walking gives you about 90% of the benefit of training for a marathon with none of the risk of injury, risk of calcified arteries, risk of a cardiovascular event when you're overexerting yourself. And certainly in these blue zones where people are living the longest, nobody's pumping iron or doing CrossFit or training for triathlons. They're following their sheep around pastures, or they're walking upstairs to buy bread, or they're gardening. And I can only tell you the statistically longest of people are really doing enjoyable, gentle physical activity every day and not worrying about trying to accomplish some heroic athletic feat.
I'm curious, you having been able to travel the world and see these populations, how would you describe their physique?
Short, lean. I mean, Okinawa, for example, fewer of the cohort of people who produced the longest of people in the history of the world, fewer than 2% ever suffered obesity. So they're not all universally thin, but because they're moving all the time, and because they're eating a whole food plant-based diet, they're not accumulating the pounds around the midsections that Americans are. But they're not muscular. You're not going to see them in a Mr. Universe competition.
I think that's the fascinating distinction, which your work brings to light, and a lot of other professionals, in the sense of we have this modern day image of, wow, you have to be this ridiculously ripped, super athlete in order to be healthy.
I'll lift up my shirt, you'll see. Just kidding. Psych. Head fake.
But that's actually not what we see in the people who actually live the longest. Is they're not worried about that. They're just living life, and they're not going to a gym and beating themselves up.
That's right. But once again, they're a product of their environment. So they live in places where every time they go to work or to a friend's house or out to eat, and occasions a walk, they have a garden out back, which they're tending every single day. Their house isn't full of electronic conveniences to do their work. They're still grinding corn by hand, or kneading bread by hand, or doing their housework by hand. And all these bursts of physical activity over the course of the day keeps them moving all day long, keeps their metabolism high, and burns more calories than the folly of thinking that we're going to sit at our desks all day long and make it up at the gym twice a week for 45 minutes a time. Most of the time we're talking to that hot chick or the hot guy instead of doing our bench presses.
Oh, we're on our phones texting people or looking at the hot chick on Instagram.
Yeah, that's more like that. Actually.
Okay, so another thing you talk about, or I think you observed in the blue zones, is the importance of purpose. How can people listening, I think it's an age-old question, like, how do I find my purpose? What am I supposed to do? Like, how can you help people, find that?
Well, I think purpose is at the intersection of values, passion, what you like to do, and an outlet for it, what you can contribute. So once again, I actually advocate, people don't take the time to just think. Go to a quiet room for 10 minutes, take a piece, I'm a big fan, piece of paper and a pencil, but also you can do a blank screen, and write down, list out your values. Are you Christian? Are you animal rights? Are you healing America or getting rid of diabetes? Whatever those values are, list them out so you can see them. Next column, list out your passions. What do you love to do? If you had $10 million in the bank, what would it be? Would it be taking care of dogs? Would it be playing pickleball all day long? Would it be traveling? Would it be knitting? Write it down. Next column are the things I'm good at. Are you good at social media like you are, Robbie? Or are you good at teaching? You're a great teacher. Or are you good at growing fruit? Or are you good at writing? But write them down. And then the final column is, after you look at the three, list out where these values and passions and competencies can come together and find an outlet where you can put them to work, put these ideas to work. And it's a 10-minute exercise, but nobody does it. But if you do it, you'll see right in black and white what you ought to be. And by the way, for most Americans, it's not their job. For only about 30% of Americans actually find purpose at work. That's 70% of us are phoning it in. We're showing up for a paycheck or for our health care or whatever the hell it is. But if you want purpose, you got to do the internal inventory, and then you got to take action. And it's not that hard, but the value proposition is worth about 8 years of extra life expectancy over living your life rudderless. And that's been, I am parroting a study done by Robert Buettner at the National Institutes on Aging. So there's good data behind it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great tenet of the work that you do, is that it is evidence-based, and there was a lot of solid research that went into this. It's not like you just traveled the world and just tried to observe and then took your observations. Oh, look, hey, here's the longest lived people. Just trust me. There's a lot of evidence-based here. So talk to us about, you mentioned the whole food plant-based diet that you observed. Tell us a little more about the dietary pattern and the foods that you observed these long-lived people eating.
Yes. Well, Robbie, to your point, my observation is not worth much at all. So our first step was doing the demography, finding the statistically longest lived areas. And we hired demographers that took 2.5 years parsing through worldwide data. And then once we find these areas, if you're diligent, you can often find dietary surveys. In fact, in all blue zones, we found dietary surveys. So if you want to know what a 100-year-old lived to be 100, you can't just ask them, what are you eating? Because they don't remember. Maybe you would know, but most people listening right now, if I asked you what you had for lunch a week ago Tuesday, you probably couldn't tell me. So asking a centenarian what they were eating when they were 30 is a waste of time. They don't remember. So, and you can't really rely on what they're eating today. It could be, mashed up potato. So, but a dietary survey will give you an idea what the population was eating. And we make it our business to go to the universities or the government offices that have archived these dietary surveys and do what's called a meta-analysis, which is a way of averaging all these studies. And very clearly, we see, it's not Dan Buettner watching these people eat. It's a compilation of what these dietary studies. And once I know they're eating 90 to 100% whole food plant-based, they're eating mostly greens and nuts and beans and tubers and whole grains. Once I know the data supports that and I go see it in a blue zone, I find an individual who represents what the population does, I can write about that individual because I am condensing what the population does. As opposed to what most journalists do is they find an individual, they interview the individual, and then they extrapolate the whole population does this. I can't tell you how frustrating it is to see these Associated Press or USA Today journalists who find the 110-year-old lady who says, my secret to longevity is egg yolks and I hate men. It's ha ha ha, but it's useless information and it's misleading because neither one of those lead to longevity.
Right. So, based on the research, what foods were they eating?
Well, first of all, they didn't eat much meat. They ate meat about 5 times a month. They ate very little fish because most of the blue zones were away from the ocean. When it came to what they drank water, tea, coffee, and wine. And then the 5 pillars: grains, greens, tubers, nuts, and beans. They're eating, I would say the cornerstone of every longevity diet in the world is beans. About a cup of beans a day. If you're eating a cup of beans a day, it's probably adding about 4 years to your life expectancy.
Powerful. It's pretty simple.
Yes. And by the way, lots of fruits too. The fruits behind you are fruits we would often see in the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica. A lot of tropical fruits. It's great. In the Mediterranean area, you're more likely to see plums and peaches and apples and some berries and so forth. But fruit, and I advocate the fruit that you like. Because again, when it comes to longevity, there's no short-term fix. You can't eat, if I told you mangoes were the healthiest food in the world, you can't eat 100 mangoes every week for the next year and think it's going to add years to your life. You got to think in decades or a lifetime. So you want to eat the fruits with enough variety and the foods with enough variety that you'll stick to it for decades.
I love what you're saying there. It's so important that you love your food. And I want you to also just mention the work you did in creating the Blue Zones Kitchen book and what type of recipes people will find in there.
That's right there. So we did the meta-analysis, 155 dietary surveys. Once I knew what 100-year-olds ate to live to be 100, the National Geographic photographer David McLean and I went back to all the blue zones, back to these far-flung villages and little mountain huts, and we watched 80, 90-year-old women cooking the foods that they've been cooking, in some cases, for 500 years. It's wonderful whole plant-based food. It's peasant food, really. But over the centuries, they've become geniuses at making this simple food taste delicious. And therein lies the secret, because when it comes to a longevity diet, the most important ingredient is taste, because you got to like it or you're not going to eat it for long enough.
That's well stated. Well stated. Okay, so I highly recommend that people pick up both books when they go to Amazon. They are absolutely, all your work is beautiful, Dan. Like, it's just always visually quite pleasing. So kudos to you on that work.